I think we'll start since we're running late. Today, Patrick and I are excited to talk to you about remote sensing and provide an introduction that will hopefully whet your appetites and keep you excited for more. And after this lecture, I'll give a more detailed lecture about satellite LiDAR in particular. So we wanted to start with this introduction to think about what remote sensing is. And I think a lot of times, especially in my field, people use remote sensing to replace satellites, but it can be a lot more. And really what remote sensing is a way of collecting observations from a distance. So I wanted to highlight the most simple case in my mind, or at least that I have fond memories of from when I was at the optics class. And I worked with two others to try and take imagery from an iPhone while strapping it to different devices. So we started first trying to loft it with balloons, and then we used a fishing pole, and ultimately we taped it to PVC piping and downloaded an app for $1.99 and took images by cutting a pool floaty and tossing it in the scene so we could have a reference length scale. And then the lead author did was Kale. We'll be highlighting a lot of his work in this lecture, but then we worked on describing these pond fractals and their distribution in this tidal flat, as it's analogous to sea ice and melt ponds in the Arctic, which is obviously a much more difficult place to sample and a lot more expensive. So you can do some very cool work with very, very little money. And at the same time, you can also do very cool work with a lot of money. So this is the other end of the spectrum that I wanted to highlight. This is the ISAT-2 mission. It's a bit over $1 billion. When people hear that number, I think they immediately think, is it worth it? And as one of the program scientists for this mission recently reminded us, that's roughly the annual budget of Halloween in the US every year. So it is a lot of money, but it's also going to so much and creating a lot of really, really important knowledge and resources for us. And so when we think about remote sensing, there are some considerations that we wanted to highlight with examples and a high-level overview, including resolution differences from spectral, spatial, and temporal, as well as what kind of signal to noise you would need to do the science you want to do and how that can be achieved. Sure. Okay. And so with spectral resolution, as we know, we can have hyperspectral resolution where we can have nanometer spacing or so or broader, and we have a really beautiful complete picture of the spectra. And then you can see how you downsample that either to multispectral or monochromatic color, that you have much less information, but not necessarily diminished application or studies. And so there's a lot of work that's been done, of course, with multispectral remote sensing or monochromatic in the case of, for example, a green LiDAR. But it's something to keep in mind. And as a different illustration, you can think, and as you played in these labs and with your own observations, when you have spectra that are hyperspectral or very complete and high resolution, you have a beautiful picture of what's happening. And you can do that with multispectral, of course, too, but you can imagine how this would look if you only had 5 bands or 1 band, and what sort of questions you might be able to ask scientifically compared to if you have the bigger picture.
And so then, of course, we have different space and time resolutions. This is a Landsat 8 image that I took of the Gulfstream front and just showed what it would look like with MODIS, showed what it would look like with a high-res model. So you can see, some things that you may or may not care about, these eddies and small filaments in the front are just erased or averaged out over time, depending on what you use. And this is a STAML diagram. I made it for a drone paper that I'm going to talk about after this, but it's a log plot, space and time. You guys may have seen a lot of these, but it's a really nice way to represent different processes of the ocean. And I just want you to think about, down from we're talking about particles that are actually a scale below this, that should be micron, all the way up to things the size of the Earth, and time scales from milliseconds up to hundreds of years. And when we're trying to observe climate change, or look at a tidal cycle in Hartselle Sound, all of these processes, physical and biological, are interacting, overlapping in these scales. And remote sensing is really one of the best ways to actually observe some of these things. That's why we're doing it. So we know a lot of y'all are familiar with remote sensing. This may be a review, but just to get everybody on the same page, we'll go over some satellite basics, and then we'll talk about some creative ways to remotely sense, and we'll talk about some societal applications. But Most satellites are in one of two orbits, either geostationary, where they're like a staring eyeball following around the Earth as it spins. So they're looking at centered on the exact same point at all times. A lot of satellites are probably the ones you'll mostly use, like MODIS, are sun-synchronous. So they're coming down typically on the daylight side, coming up on the nighttime side, and going around the Earth, a much smaller view. I can just stop it here. Just click advance, there we just go. Yeah, so just an example, I think Jeremy is going to give a beautiful explanation of this, but this is PACE, it'll be sun sync. So you can see the types of swaths that it's getting every orbit. It's really nice. You should look at the MODIS, the ones they made with the MODIS team, and 99 of this. This is a much nicer version. Yeah. And so you can see, yeah, and you can see here, you know, the poles actually, depending on your application, you might get a lot more coverage, a lot more overlap. Whereas it's, you know, they say near daily at the equator because there is a bit of a gap on most of the satellites we're using. Just thinking about what scales are covered by different satellites. Goes east and goes west. I'll show, actually in the talk on Monday, I'll show some data from these, but you know, you can do really amazing work with a satellite that's staring at the exact same spot and imaging every hour. And these are used for weather. There are some areas in the ocean that are observed by these geostationary satellites every 15 minutes. And so if you're in a hyperdynamic system, you can really do some cool science that way. But it's not just satellites. The NOAA Twin Otters are used for all kinds of observations. You guys may have heard of Avarice. It's a sensor from JPL that's an occupied aircraft. You know, so we're going down a little bit in the scale of resolution. You can use drones. This is some work I did in Antarctica where we were launching and flying over whales. It motivated some work I'm going to talk about in the middle of the presentation. You can use tethered platforms. There's always an amazing session at AGU of these people that just are DIY MacGyver types, and they are just set on using balloons for science. It's worth checking out. And so we observed the ocean on a number of scales. Here I've downsampled again from Landsat resolution, so 30-meter ocean color up to 100, up to a kilometer, up to 10 kilometers. And you're seeing different processes, but maybe you're seeing on a different temporal scale when you lose the spatial resolution. And again, we can remotely sense from all of these platforms, from moorings all the way up to satellites. Have you guys seen this figure? Anybody seen this exact figure from NASA before? I mean, they get a lot of mileage out of it. But there is a huge fleet of satellites in orbit right now, many that are complementary, only a small subset of them that are ocean color specifically. But there's a lot of remote sensing going on. And I think how we combine those different platforms is a real avenue for advancement. Who knows what satellite this is? Yeah, CZCS. So this, what's that? Nimbus 7. Yeah, and the sensor that collected this image is the Coastal Zone Color Scanner. And I wasn't around at this time, but it's amazing to read some of the papers that came out right after this. Just the lack of knowledge of how patchy and dynamic and heterogeneous the ocean surface was. I mean, imagine you only have ship transects and some low-flying aircraft, and then you go to getting an image like this. So we will mostly be discussing, except for Kelsey's next lecture, passive remote sensing. But I do just want to remind everybody that there's a whole world of active remote sensing. So in most passive, we're using the sun as our source, and it's reflecting in the satellite. That's what we measure. But there are plenty of satellites that send out an electromagnetic signal, be it LiDAR, be it radar, and measure that response. And you get a lot of power from having control over your source. And I do just want to point out, this is a log wavelength scale, but you don't need the sun for a lot of really nice sea surface temperature measurements. You know, the Earth is emitting basically like a black body, but at a much extended wavelength. Anyway, so we can measure SST day and night as long as there aren't clouds. And most sea surface height measurements are active. So whether it's again in the microwave wavelengths for radar or in the optical.
I didn't really know where to put this slide, but I just wanted to remind people, if you haven't worked with imagery data, all it is just a square of numbers where each pixel is just a value, right? And I think most people know this, but every image is actually just this. It's encoded as some color value. And when we're going to multispectral, we're just stacking those, so you go X and Y, and then you just add a Z. And during the lab today, you guys are just going to use some images from your phone for the polarization lab. But again, I think there's nothing fancy about an image. It's just a matrix of numbers. You have anything you want to say on this one, or you want me to keep going? Okay.
I guess mainly the, oh yeah, you
No,
can
go
say.
ahead.
Oh, so with ocean color, of course, most of the signal is coming from the atmosphere, and so you have to appropriately correct for the atmospheric effects and then remove them so that you can get the ocean signal. And this is a slide from Kurt where it goes through just the different things that are interacting with light in the air that need to be corrected for appropriately. So specular reflectance, Rayleigh scattering, there's different aerosols in the air, and you can especially imagine how at different times of the year, different events, for example, volcanic eruption or wildfire or super clean air, you'll have a very different aerosol signature. And the capabilities of what we're using to measure them may not be able to fully resolve what these particles are in the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of air that can come, ideally not from atmospheric correction schemes when applied to ocean color data. But when done well, we have beautiful spectra that we can resolve from the ocean after removing the signal, which is typically quoted, I think, to be about 90% or so of the signal we see at the top of the atmosphere in terms of the radiances. So most of the signal we throw away, but we know from playing around with the uncertainty and making these our own measurements that this can be an area that if it's not done well and you're not fully aware of what the uncertainty is, you can end up with ocean data that are not as high quality as you might want them to be. And Emmanuel and I will be talking a little bit about that more tomorrow in a lot more detail. But again, this is another view graphically of what that looks like in terms of the fractional contribution of radiance at the top of the atmosphere for these different aspects compared to what we want at the surface. Oh yeah, this also gets into signal space relative to noise. So I just wanted to put something up as an abstraction, just so you can, think about when you have signal that's super strong, higher magnitudes from your noise, you can think about using that signal and using the data probably for possibly more purposes than you can when the signal and noise are really close together and very convoluted, and it's more difficult to disentangle the noise. So this is just a rendering of that. And I also think that Jeremy is going to talk a bit about this next week. As we know, ocean color is an inverse problem. I don't know if anybody would care that much about remote sensing reflectance, the parameter, if we didn't have a way of separating that into the components we do care about. And so what we're seeing is remote sensing reflectance, and then what we want are the optical constituents that contribute to absorption and scattering. So because of that, again, it's really important that we have appropriate techniques in place to do that well. So you can have the same remote sensing reflectance, for example, with different optical constituents. Because of that, we advocate for using ancillary data or models or having as many sanity checks as possible so that when you have, so you're in a solution space, you can think, okay, I'm here at this time or this place. Do we really expect that we might have this much CDOM or not from a, from a signal relative to what you know? Related to this, and because it's an inverse problem, you have a lot of products that are used by the community that all derive from remote sensing reflectance. For example, in my PhD, I used every single one of those, I think, particle size, phytoplankton carbon, composition, net parent production into a food web model. And in practice, in this modeling work, they're often used as if they're independent products. So if you have phytoplankton carbon or you have a diatom fraction or something, it can be assumed, or people might think this is great, these are separate and true products, but when you really think about it, they're all derived from the same product, which is remote sensing reflectance. And, of course, within that, chlorophyll, different IOPs, et cetera. So this is another huge consideration to think about, and might also relate to the high degree of correlation within these products and their utility for models and applications downstream.
Okay, so there are lots of amazing platforms out there that again, we should leverage and we are leveraging in amazing ways. I'm going to talk about one that was much simpler. So again, I joined this lab during my PhD that was doing all kinds of cool drone remote sensing, but mostly for coastlines and megafauna. And I got really excited about ocean color, and the community wasn't really doing it robustly. So partially I left this class excited to try and make it much more robust. And I kind of just, I'm going to go through just a brief 5-minute story of just kind of doing it yourself and coming up with your own approaches. You guys worked on these glint and reflection removal techniques yesterday. You tried some, none of them worked for me. And so I came up with a new one, which you guys will probably have to do. I was using a 5-channel imaging radiometer. So you guys were having point radiometers yesterday, but you can have one that just takes an image and every single pixel is a calibrated radiometric spectra. This one, again, is 5 bands. We were launching it on a big cinematographic drone that could fly for like an hour. And this was my version of the skylight block technique, where because I have an imaging radiometer and I'm assuming all pixels have the same response, I can just pick the 100 by 100 pixel region of the image that's in the water and I can get it kind of far away. We're on a fairly small boat, but it's definitely also having an influence here. Tell me what you guys see in these images. What's going on? Glenn on the left one, definitely. What's that? Wave trains, yeah.
The shadow
It could be. It might be a bird. Right there. I'm not actually sure. That's it. Amanda, did you have something?
No.
Anything else? The color. So this is out. We flew this one out in the Gulf Stream. We flew this just off the Duke Marine Lab docks. What's weird about this? Yeah, there's a major gradient in the color actually, and it's not. The optical constituents are not changing in that image. Here I just took that same image, and then I plotted the bands as a function of angle off nadir, again in a single image. And they're not changing equally. This dash line is a ratio of green to blue. And so you're actually seeing this spectrally changing sky contribution to your image, which is really hard. You certainly can't remove it by multiplying the whole thing by the sky times 0.028. This is actually after I've calibrated it, so don't worry about this, but I came up with an approach to make it like this. I had that sensor on a gimbal, and here I'm just showing in a bunch of different images as a function of relative azimuth angle off the sun and relative viewing angle off nadir. And again, this is just what we see, but it's just the exact same. It's just a little bit better calibrated. So you can see as we get up to the horizon, that's 60 degrees off. So we're looking like this. It's extremely bright, and this is all in the blue. And what this looks like is a function of changing atmosphere. It's a function of changing scattering in the water, function of wave facets. It's really hard to do this well. But I spent a long time, and I was able to go from these images to actually getting all the images looking just like this across a whole flight. And I won't go into too much detail, but the way I actually did this was I took that skylight blocked image. So I have a pure LW spectra. And then I took a bunch of images from the drone on the gimbal in that same exact spot. And I just assumed that the whole image was the same thing and subtracted out the difference. And so now I have basically a map to subtract out from each image. It's fairly simple. If you look at the paper, the math is like 2 equations. It makes a big assumption that the atmosphere doesn't change, and your viewing angle needs to be exactly the same over your whole flight. But I had a gimbal on my drone that held it to within 1 degree, even as the drone was bopping around, and it worked really well. But in the open ocean, is there any spatial information in this? You guys think? What's accounting for the variability here? Say it again.
Waves.
yeah, waves, facets, sunbeams coming out. That's probably not variability of phytoplankton right there. But in an estuary, actually, and again, the scale here, this is 60 meters by 40 meters. And this is tiny. These pixels are 3 centimeters. But in an estuary, actually, there are plumes of turbidity that are highly variable. Maybe you really care about that. And so this is an ongoing problem. But what I found out was that, that your ability to distinguish the signal to noise, as Kelsey showed, is very dependent on the amount of absorption and backscattering going on in the water. Maybe there are areas where this technique is really helpful, areas where it isn't. Here's what some flights look like. This is about an hour flight. We flew across the Gulf Stream. I converted this to chlorophyll. So we cross the front, we go back. There's all this variability here. And if we look at this compared to some Modis pixels, this is my flight, and it all fits within 4 pixels. Maybe you care about this, maybe you don't. It's going to be very application dependent, but there's a lot going on that we don't see, and there's a lot of ways you guys can help reveal this. Here's what a bunch of flights look like. Emmanuel was wondering if these were phytoplankton. And again, this is the front of the Gulf Stream, and this is the coastal side, so it's high. This is Olchi, so this is basically the highest specific ocean color sensor we have. These are 300-meter pixels. But of course, we can try to use Landsat and other much higher resolution satellites, and these approaches are really improving. This is a figure I made for a paper Juliana Tavora led, and you can see this is Modis. Here's the default Landsat product. And then if we actually atmospherically correct it specifically for the ocean, we can reveal much better patterns. Here's chlorophyll calculated from that default Landsat product versus atmospherically corrected one. We're going really fast. The last thing I want to mention before we go into some societal applications is just there are really complementary satellites to ocean color, and we're going to spend all of this class on ocean color, but altimetry, I feel like it's not as well integrated into the ocean color community as it could be. SWAT just launched like in February. I mean, SWAT and PACE are going to be amazing together to think about how physics influences biology. This is what altimetry used to look like. 25-kilometer pixels. This is what altimetry looks like now, as of 4 months ago. And this is my study area, so I love this little spot. I mean, this really is going to change how we think about physical dynamics in the ocean. SWAT is like, actually, this is a little misleading. This is the high resolution sampling phase. So they did like 6 months where it was in the lower orbit before they moved up. So it'll be a little bit lower resolution than this, but I think it's like 5 to 8 kilometers. Does anybody know for sure? I think it's like a factor of 4 better than it has been. And there are a lot of altimetry basically doesn't work anywhere here because there are tidal influences that can't be resolved. And yeah, it's going to be amazing. We're going to be able to see all this stuff. Sea surface temperature is much better integrated. This is an image I took down from EcoStress, which was a really high quality radiometer on the International Space Station. And you can, a lot of these are clouds. This is land, but you can just see amazing patterns that are driving a lot of the biology that are maybe carrying it away.
What is
So
that?
just
What do you think of temperature?
oh yeah, it's temperature. I thought you know where. Yeah, sorry. So this is SST, but actually this is brightness temperature. EcoStress doesn't correct to SST. So this is on the assumption that it's a black body and you're measuring at 12 microns. What is the temperature of that emitting medium in Kelvin? For brightness temperature, you can't go, it's not exactly the Kelvin of the surface because we're not subtracting any atmospheric effects here. Questions on anything Kelsey and I discussed so far? I just want to say people talk about like eddies, but this is an eddy with an eddy, and there's an eddy in that eddy. And there's definitely more eddies in there.
So we also wanted to touch on in this lecture what I would consider to be somewhat unique aspect of remote sensing, and that it can offer continuous or near continuous monitoring of Earth from local to global scales throughout a variety of situations, so-called societal disasters, or just bizarre environmental circumstances. So especially given that we are going to be working in this community for the next few decades, we really wanted to highlight for us some of the things that we're excited about, where we can contribute, and where we think the science is going, and where remote sensing is particularly well suited to address these questions. So I wanted to highlight some work that's coming out of Shaman Hughes' lab in the University of South Florida, where they're finding massive plumes of sargassum. You can see in that photo, which to me almost looks fake, I think it's 200 million tons of sargassum are floating up along the shores of South Florida. And you can see from the time series here that it wasn't happening years ago. So they're curious and investigating this as it's a new normal, perhaps, but also because, as you can imagine, it costs a lot of money in tourism losses and environmental damage for animals that have a really hard time swimming through these structures. Because if you've ever gone through the sargassum or seen it, it's very strong. I wanted to highlight this because there's an ongoing discussion about the value, financially or monetary value, of ocean science, and I know that it can be a controversial, touchy topic to try to assign dollars to the science that we do. And to mention that, or just highlight, there are studies that are working on this, if you're interested. And I think especially the link in terms of healthcare is a more provocative, profound one, because we know that there can be ocean situations that can affect the health of the ecosystem, not only in the ocean waters, but also on land for people, namely through harmful algal blooms. I also wanted to share this work that I'm really excited about. Kale led, he was in the first photo with the fishing pole, and Emmanuel and I are good friends with him. And he had this idea to test whether or not we can detect the climate change trend on Modus Aqua's 20th birthday. And so it has been in orbit for 20 years as of July 2022, sorry, well, I guess the end of June technically. And we previously thought through models that it would take at least 30 years to detect the climate change trend because of the enormous amount of natural variability. And a lot of these models were using univariate or one parameter type analyses. And Kale, whose background training is in statistics, asked the question, if we do a multivariate statistical trend analysis in color, so using different bands from Modus Aqua and remote sensing reflectance, can that allow us to detect a trend? And there's not any answer is yes. So this is a graph, and the way you could view it as a signal to noise graph, or you could also view it as anywhere that there's color versus not color. So the magenta versus white, that's where a significant trend has been identified that can be attributed to climate change, as opposed to interannual or seasonal variability. As you can see, it's a little bit more than half the ocean by area. And when you compare that to what can be accomplished by using just chlorophyll, as many people have done, it shrinks substantially. I believe in percentages, it's something like 6% of the ocean can have a detectable climate change trend with chlorophyll. So that this has profound implications to me, at least thinking about where in the ocean, then you can think about wanting to investigate or study the causes of what's underlying this trend, both optically and environmentally, as well as right now, a lot of people are looking to the ocean for solutions for climate or otherwise, food insecurity, energy insecurity, et cetera. There's places now that we can monitor from remote sensing to see how they're changing, possibly think about implementing protected areas or not, or think about the laws of the sea, which, as you probably know, as you go outside the coast, it's kind of the Wild West, and there's not a lot there in terms of protection. The idea of this, just with a figure, is that you have, if you know the uncertainty in both of your variates, or consider a variates, you can have this sort of like ellipsoid where you can have maybe you have a trend in one variable and the other one to different degrees, but by maximizing information across all of the bands, you can investigate a multivariate trend of them together. And again, just to show what that looks like, you can also quantify the time of emergence in this case, we're using a model, and you can see on the left hand, the years of data simulation on the x-axis and the emergent time on the y-axis. And the analysis that we found Modus Aqua fits really well and snuggles up to that model prediction. But here you can start to ask questions about how long should your mission be in orbit? What can we gain by extending, for example, a mission by a few years, which is really relevant now because Modus Aqua has been a workhorse for 21 years now, and a lot of people are thinking about decommissioning it because with the launch of PACE, Modus Aqua will be multispectral by comparison, and there is value in just having some observations for a time series and to have this continuation, in my view. So that's what this is. We also wanted to touch on within our generation in age, just the significance of the missions that are being designed now and the work that we're doing now. It's coming, as we know, at a really important time in human history, and we'll be living through possibly some big tipping points, and that can cause a lot of fear and maybe scariness too, but also I think it's extremely empowering to think about the research that we do and the missions that we'll be working on, and how these data could be used to help inform our understanding and possibly help with solutions.
Dave Schimmel gave what I thought was quite a moving talk at the Joint Science Workshop for NASA about a month ago, where he was just, I like optics for optics' sake, and it's really fun and it's awesome to be here working on everything, but you guys will be leading the field, maybe PIs on new satellites, certainly helping to decide what new satellites get launched. And he had this quote that's basically, he said, the peak radiative forcing in the best case scenario will be in the next 15 to 20 years. And the satellites we start planning for right now are going to observe that period of, peak heat on the Earth. And so it's up to us to plan those satellites.
Yeah, and I also really wanted to touch on this document, which is available publicly online on NASA's OBB website. But a group of authors worked really hard on creating a decadal strategic vision for the next decade of observations and identified 5 grand challenges. Within each of those challenges, there have been missions identified, either currently planned missions or possible in our wildest dreams type missions. And the document's really, I think, fun to read. And so I'd recommend that if you're interested, you give it a look and see where your current research fits in, or if you find yourself inspired or motivated by any of the aspects that are mentioned, possibly be an area for you to bring your research as you think about developing your research plan. Yeah, we wanted to end with this one. So.
Great, thank you. Perfect. Question?
I had a question just about Kelsey figure from 2023 with I guess maybe 2 slides, one more, this one.
Yeah.
Why is it that we see, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but like we can see more, we have better signal near the equators like versus poles.
Yeah, it comes down to a bit of the signal to noise discussion and also data availability. And these are areas that typically have lower interannual variability and better coverage than at the higher latitudes, which have a lot of high natural heterogeneous environmental variability. So it would, I think, in order to get, and I think this is here, and it is kind of cut off here at the low labs, but in order to get really climate change attributable type signal, and obviously we know that, for example, the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than we thought. It's clearly warming due to climate change. But the issue with this remote sensing is the paucity of measurements that you have during these times, since we're using a passive ocean color sensor. So it's maybe 6 months or so of kind of patchy coverage per year, statistically, to have enough power to say this is an area with significant trend relative to the noise is more of a challenge.
Okay, so like even though you might have more satellite overpasses at those higher latitudes,
It's just cloudy
and so time
and dark.
Yeah.
Do you have a question, actually? Go ahead.
I was just your research that we did for different areas. I was just curious on how you know that the figures on the outside.
Tell me when. These? Not this one? This one maybe?
Yeah.
So yeah, I didn't really explain that, but basically this is just an image, just like from your phone. And I just, each one of these boxes, I actually should have put markers on here as opposed to just a line. But this is just 12 boxes and I just plotted the average from each box across this line. And then the same thing here. So there's just 12 steps and we're just kind of walking off the image. And the same, yeah. Questions on anything else?
Just the Kale paper multivariate regression, the purple coded question figure. It was like signal to noise ratio greater than 2%. I have no idea what that figure is telling me, other than that you're saying that there's a significant trend of 50% of the ocean. Can you give a brief explanation of what that is doing?
You can ask the question, how likely is it that the signal can be used to climate change? And the signal to noise is, you know, how many, there's always a possibility something happens. So when we use this two standard deviation or 95% confidence in the call, that this is correct. But the absolute is really 99%, and it still was mostly there. So it's basically, you know, it could, there's always a possibility with data that it's an average. And so this is a way by which he convince himself that it's not right. But the trend is indeed in the.
And what part of the data is the trend in?
In a parameter that is built out of all the columns. So you look at what you can see that's common to all the columns.
So what we call it.
Right?
Yeah.
For all the of both.
It's so cool. It hasn't even gotten to the fact yet.
So it's more common.
We just got the things.
How that it's more concerned is removing it.
The preprints on that, yeah.
And looking for the projector that changes together.
As far as in some way.
In some way. It's all the best. It's much more robust than the future solutions we can better.
And how do you go from changing color to climate change?
Sorry, I didn't catch that because I was talking
So
about.
it's a long trend. So the idea was over this period, it's gonna be in a specific direction.
And you're trying to differentiate from these other decadal or
Yeah, like
multi-decadal oscillations like the
ENSO.
NAO and INSO and.
I can send you the paper also. I don't know if it would help clear it up and spend
Yeah.
some time.
Yeah.
It hasn't been published yet, but we have the proofs as of yesterday, so, yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, how does ocean color stand as a parameter for climate change? What do you think?
Yeah, knowing what you know about what influences ocean color products. And what sort of things would be influenced by climate change environmentally.
So it could be more tightly stratifying the surface ocean and reducing nutrient input from depth. It could be changing currents. I mean, those are things.
But I agree with Terrence. If there's no mechanistic like. This is, it's just like. Specifically something's happening. Something that's happening, right?
Right, like sea surface temperature is an easy one to say, okay, 98% of the sea surface has warmed.
But it doesn't tell you about the ecology. We know that this parameter is influenced by ocean ecology. That's the difference. Yes, people are seeing it in SSP.
Right.
But the question is the ecology element by the change in the system in the ocean? And this is the way in which, without yet understanding fully what it says about the ecology,
Something's happening.
something is.
But I think it's good to be skeptical. It's just climate change is the only monotonic trend that's happening over this time frame that we know of, but maybe there's another.
So, really, yeah, it's definitely climate change, but what it's doing is.
We don't know, that's your word.
Yeah, we compare this to an ecological model, but it's a model and it was for the sake of appeasing the reviewers. because we didn't want to be overly speculative. But there is a broad discussion in the appendix of this where you basically walk through. If you have a trend in this one wavelength or in these two wavelengths together, what do we know about where accessory pigments are absorbing work versus not? Same with CDOM, same with community shift. So the idea would be, it could be some combination of enhanced CDOM, physiological changes, community shift changes, could be size changes. But as Colin and Emmanuel said, it's super easy to measure and process remote sensing reflectance from satellites. It is challenging to interpret. And this is where, to me, this is the most exciting figure, because you can say, where do we have time series data that we, at these places that we can look into that are higher resolution and are of the optical constituents themselves, to ask what's underlying, what's the root cause of this change that we see in color from a data motivated point of view.
I just comment, like, I think your response to this figure is that, well, we know the higher latitudes are moving faster. And you're looking at basically subtropical gyres where the bodies are very clear. You think of them as being relatively invariant, but you have to look at the magnitude of the change relative to a background. And so, yeah, the waters are always clear there, but that doesn't mean that they're not changing. And so, you know, in the higher latitudes, there's so much spatial variability, so much temporal variability, it's really difficult to pull out a trend in light of the very large changes from spring, from winter to summer, and from North Atlantic oscillation plus or minus index between 30 just come on. And so that is interesting. Don't forget about those clear gyres. You can sense changing in clear gyres because they are so invariant. You can see trends in places relatively. That's what this is.
I think the other thing that Kelsey mentioned that I maybe should have had a couple slides on is there's a framework that I call tip and queue, where you get some tips from these hotspots, and you queue up a cruise, right? There's only limited cruise dollars we have, and only a certain number of gliders, but we can target them to go to really interesting areas based on exactly this. We don't quite know what's happening. We queue them up, send them out. Sort of an integrated ocean observing system approach.
We'll go back to CBAS data. You have data in CBAS for 30 years, 20 years, and you can pick those specific locations where there is a time series of, non-element particles, time series of particle accident.
I'm not sure how to understand why it's pixel dominant significant, because we have two processes driving the emitting significance in the way the time processing within the significance, and then the diffusion of the time and so the also the kind of ransom. So you will see a time
Yeah, I think exactly. Then there will be no trend. And nothing is.
Or the trend is not that significant. So remember, it depends on how good coverage we have. So regions where there's a lot of cloudiness, there's a lot of patchiness, we cannot yet see a trend. That's mean that the white don't say climate change is not affecting this region. Just say we could not pick it out in a significant way. Doesn't mean it's not there. It means it's not. The methods used are not robust enough to pick up a small a change if there is one.
So you have to come up with a new approach to find it.
Yeah. And if people are interested, I can send that paper along, and I think Kale would be more than happy to answer questions, especially about statistics that he ran.
I think this paper, you guys clearly liked it. Kale and Kelsey have some really simple questions with straightforward analyses using ocean color that are really powerful. There's a lot left to be done there.
And they met during this class. They didn't know each other before coming to this class, and now the best buddies and all the